Everyone. Thanks so much. I hope you had a good short break there. Next up is Sid Dutta, Vice President, Data Privacy and Protection at Activision Blizzard King. Sid will be presenting on designing and implementing a data protection framework, taking a risk-based approach. Let me tell you a little bit about Sid. Sid has led data privacy and protection solutions and services globally at various large corporations. Prior to his current role, he was the head of product management for data security products at Micro Focus. He also held the position of vice president, global head of data protection and applied cryptography at WorldPay. Sid sits on the board of Cloud Security Alliances, CSA, Ohio River Valley chapter, and holds a chief information security advisor position. Sid has contributed thought leadership to the vendor community and participated on multiple customer advisory boards, including IBM and Micro Focus. Please welcome to the stage, Sid Dutta.
Hello and welcome to the 2022 Encryption Consulting Virtual Conference. I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Sid Dutta, and I'm Vice President, Data Privacy and Protection for Activision Blizzard King. Today, I'll be presenting a session which essentially takes a risk-based approach towards designing and implementing a data protection framework. And hopefully, this will actually provide you with some insights and some practical knowledge that I'm privileged to share with all of you. I've been in the industry for over 21 years now, and the last 7 or 8 years have been on the information security side, predominantly on the data security side. And I've ran data protection programs across multiple large corporations in the financial services sector. Then I was at the vendor side of the table, where I led product management for data security products until I came over at Activision Blizzard King. Without further ado, I'm going to be jumping right into the topic and to share my thoughts in terms of how to take a risk-based approach, where to start, what are the different things that are required to be done in order to implement an effective data protection framework, and entirely based on my experience and my opinions. There's obviously no one-size-fits-all strategy here. Different enterprises and different security leaders have implemented data protection framework in different ways, and all of them are equally effective. I just want to kind of share my thoughts in terms of what has worked for me, what I've thought was effective, and helped me narrow down some of the scoping and get some quick wins, as well as be more effective in terms of reducing the risk. So there's no surprise, that we are in the age of data. Several years back, Thomas H. Davenport actually talked about that every enterprise, has big data in their future, and every enterprise will eventually, be a data company. And lo and behold, we are here, effectively in the age of data, where every single minute, of the day, data is being produced, and through various channels, through social interactions and over the internet. And data itself, essentially doesn't have a lot of meaning, and enterprises are trying to extract, the information, out of the data. Information essentially gives data some value, data, some meaning, some context. And from those information, they're also trying to derive some critical business insights that they can actually take, to make some business decisions and put some actions behind it to derive, certain business outcomes, which could be, increased revenue, higher retention of customers, monetizing data, increasing, their, profits, so on and so forth. So basically, we have a huge number of data, that every enterprise is collecting, and the growth of data, as you can see from the graph, is just like not bound. 175 zettabytes of data that we will actually have by 2025. Now there's a quick trivia. How many zeros are in a zettabyte? Anyone? Well, don't feel bad about it. I had no idea. So I Googled it up, and it turns out a zettabyte has 21 zeros. Uh, you know, it's like the Arizona summer. I lived in Phoenix, Arizona for like 15 years. Once it got past 110 Fahrenheit, it's just too hot. I mean, you don't count whether it's 113 or 20 or 122. So this is kind of like that, right? It's too big. Bottom line, too much of data is being generated, too much of data is being consumed, and too much of data is being processed. Now, what happens that when you have so much of data that needs to be collected, that needs to be processed, that needs to be analyzed, in order to gain some critical business insight, and you can put into some actions. You're talking about a lot of infrastructure needs, right? I mean, you need the capex, for investing in your infrastructure and tools. You need the personnel to essentially manage that infrastructure and analyze that data. So it becomes a cost prohibitive proposition, for a lot of enterprises. And what happens is that cloud becomes, just an obvious choice, a natural, choice for enterprises to adopt, given the practically infinite scale, the features, the ubiquity, the consumption-based pricing, the elasticity. All of these, kind of are making cloud a very, very, attractive proposition for enterprises to have that data, stored and processed and analyzed. So, the cloud market has basically grown every year, and as you can see, by 2024, it's a $663 billion market across different cloud, whether it's across multiple cloud services providers or the type of cloud models. Whether you're talking about infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service, and so on and so forth. Then we are also dealing with increasing number of data breaches, right? More the data, the more information you're collecting about individuals, about things, about business. What we are seeing, from the latest IBM Security Ponemon Institute of 2022 cost of data breach report, that 83% of the organizations, have had more than one data breaches. And given that the rapid cloud adoption that we talked about, there's a lot of instances where hasty decisions are being made. There's not a lot of planning. There's a lot of this misconception about traditional security controls are essentially going to be extending when workloads actually move to the cloud. Misconfigurations. Everything in a cloud is an API, right? So those traditional security controls, they no longer extend into the cloud, and hence you have a lot more newer and many more configurational elements to essentially make sure to have your data not exposed. And this is actually contributing to a significant number of data breaches, as you can see from the last the report, the summary that IBM Security and Ponemon Institute have put together, that 45% of the breaches were cloud-based. Last but not least, global data protection and privacy regulations. Every country, now has their data privacy and protection regulation. In a lot of cases, some of the states are having, case in point, CCPA in the United States, and every other state is also coming up with their own until we have a national data privacy regulation. And the cost of non-compliance is significant, for a lot of companies. And when people or consumers don't trust you in terms of how you are handling their data, they don't want to do business with you, right? So it's very, very important to essentially have a very solid data privacy and protection framework in order to build and retain and enhance the trust of your customers. Well, I don't disagree with you, Tweak. Yes, this is too much pressure. So what do we do? There has to be a way that we can enhance and expand on our data privacy and protection strategies. And one of the ways that we'll be actually doing this is what I'm going to be sharing, right? So adopting a risk-based approach towards data protection, which is today's session. And of course, well, Willie, I know you are probably going to be testing me on this, and I'll put a disclaimer right in front. I'm not the risk management guy, right? I am not the GRC person, but I'm definitely going to share, few risk management concepts so that I can essentially get to the point I was trying to make, that how do you create a data protection framework either using a risk-based approach. Fortunately, I have had my peers and colleagues in different teams who were experts, and I still do in my current company. And I take and solicit, their help in terms of implementing a risk-based data protection framework. So I'm still going to take you through a little bit of the risk management 101, since you asked, Willie. And here you go. The foundation of risk is based on these three things, right? One, you have the asset, that you need to protect. And of course, in this case, we're talking about data, and that data could be, personal information, PHI, health information, PCI, any sort of business sensitive data, intellectual properties, or confidential information around mergers and acquisitions, financial reports that are not yet public, so on and so forth. So that is what you need to protect, right? And the risk is essentially based on that asset. If there was no asset to begin with, obviously we're not talking about any risk. Then you get to a point of where the systems that store and process, this asset, in this case the data, the vulnerabilities associated with those systems. And there's nothing really called zero vulnerability. And just a perfect segue to the third foundational pillar of risk management is the threat. If there are assets, there will be threats who will try to exploit the vulnerabilities in order to get to the asset and then use it, right, or misuse it, so to speak. And when risk is actually assessed, they are assessed based on the likelihood of the threats exploiting the vulnerabilities and the impact that will be caused to the organization if the threats actually exploited the vulnerability and got to the asset. Now, of course, likelihood is basically a function of the different vulnerabilities, exposure, threats, mitigating controls. So how likely the threat is essentially going to be exploiting the vulnerability. Now, if you've got very solid mitigating controls, the likelihood is going to be low. Impact is essentially the function of business criticality. What does it mean to the business, to the organization, if the threat actually exploited the vulnerability and got to the asset? How much damage this is going to cause to the organization? Can it run as is? Can it go out of business? So on and so forth, right? So you're essentially looking at risk based on the likelihood and the impact. So when it comes to data privacy and protection risk assessment factors, how do you really get to assessing the likelihood and the impact? So there are different factors that will actually go in. From my perspective, I want to identify, those different factors, and my peers and colleagues and the teams that I work with on the risk side, they would actually take those factors into consideration to come up with, a risk assessment that I can use in terms of my decision-making process, right? So when you have the impact factors being considered, there could be several things, right? I don't know what sort of data am I talking about. What's that segment of the category of that data? And it could be an identifier, a personal identifier category. It could be a sensitive information about an individual, or a business. There may be certain business category in terms of intellectual properties and so on and so forth. Then we get to the data classification, factor. That do I consider this as a restricted classified information, or I'm talking about confidential, I'm talking about internal or public. And based on that, my risk is either going to be high or low. Data volume would be another case. Obviously, the risk associated with 1 million records is going to be significantly lower than, let's say, 1 trillion records, or 100 million records, and so on and so forth, right? So if that number of data records got breached, then you're looking at a significant impact. And then, other use cases like, what's the data being used for, and so on and so forth. Likelihood factors would be another one, right? Where my data is and who has access to it and how is it being used, how much time that data actually is retained. All of them provides a measurement of the likelihood of that data, essentially being exploited by the different threats, that are persistent, right? So these are different, factors that would go into the risk assessment, process. Now, keep in mind, like any of these factors could influence both the likelihood and the impact. This is just my take on, how I see, that what are the different drivers and factors, that impact likelihood and impact. Now, when it comes to the risk assessment matrix, when you look at the likelihood and the impact, and you try to kind of graph, that am I looking at a high risk or am I looking at a low risk area? So what I have used is a 5x5 matrix of likelihood and impact, and you could do as simple as a 2x2, where you can say high and low impact and high and low likelihood. Yes, we can do 3x3, high, medium, low, so on and so forth. So I've taken a 5x5. So when you're looking at the lower left-hand side of the matrix, you're looking at a very low risk and a very low impact, where essentially risk being a product of likelihood and impact, you're looking at a negligible risk. So as you kind of vary the likelihood and the impact, either you could be on the low side or even on the high side. When it comes to something that has a very high likelihood of being exploited and a very high impact to the company if the threat exploited the vulnerabilities and exposed the data, then you're looking at a critical risk. All right, so when we get to the point of low risks, negligible, very low, and low, those are the areas that are acceptable. That means that as it is right now, I probably would not have to do anything about it because I'm accepting the risk. Because in order to close or reduce the risk any further, it's probably not going to be worth it in terms of the investments, right? So the cost-benefit analysis needs to be done, and the business could actually make a decision of staying put. Let's keep it status quo because we can accept the risk. And when you get into the higher levels of risk, like this, you're in a medium risk level. In those areas, it can be acceptable with some mitigating controls that needs to be put in place. So when you get to the unacceptable risk areas, then obviously you got to do something about it, right? So we are going to get into the risk mitigation strategies. When it comes to risk mitigation, we have 4 areas of risk mitigation. You can accept the risk, you can avoid the risk, you can transfer the risk, or reduce it. When it comes to acceptance, you are essentially making a decision that I'm not going to be really doing anything about this risk. I'm just going to accept it. And the investment that I need to make to reduce whatever risk currently I have, doesn't make a lot of sense. It's the CBAs just don't work. So if that risk is within my risk appetite and my tolerance level, then I'm just going to accept it and essentially let it be, stay put, keep it in status quo. The other thing that you could do is avoid. And when you're talking about risk avoidance in the data protection context, you're basically saying, don't even store any sensitive data, don't collect any personal information, or store it in a system that has zero vulnerability. So that's not something that we can actually afford in a lot of cases. The other thing would be transference of the risk. In a lot of cases, what you do is you make a conscious decision to hand over the responsibility of risk management to a different organization, to a different entity, because your organization is not able to handle and implement the risk mitigation strategy. So you basically have that transferred over to a different organization within the same enterprise, or to a third party, like a cloud services provider, or to a managed security services provider. So that's another way to mitigate risk. The last is basically about the reduction of the risk, which we are going to be taking a close look at. So when you decide to take actions, when you decide to put some controls with your processes and your solutions and your stores, data storage, to reduce the risk, you are looking at an acceptable amount of residual risk coming out of that process. So you have the inherent risk that you don't think that you can accept or avoid or transfer. So you got to reduce it. So how you reduce it, by applying these security controls, and then you end up with a residual risk that you can accept. Now remember, residual risk cannot be zero, right? There's nothing called zero risk. All you're trying to do is get that risk level down to a point where it's within your appetite or within your tolerance level, I guess. So that's what the risk reduction strategy is after. I know this could be confusing, this could be overwhelming, and sometimes we just don't know where to start. And it's absolutely okay to basically ask that question. And as far as this session, and as far as I'm concerned, data inventory is what I'm going to be proposing as your first step towards implementing a risk-based data privacy and protection framework. Now, data inventory starts with discovering data. Know where your data is, know what data you collect, know how are they being accessed, how are they being managed. In a lot of cases, companies struggle with that. Obviously, there are like solutions, tools that will help you do that. Segment and categorize your data after you've discovered it. Not all data have the same type of risk associated, because not all data are the same. So it's very important to make sure that if you have 100 data elements that you're collecting, out of those 100, how are they categorized? How are they segmented? Are we talking about personal data? Are we talking about health information? Are we talking about business data? So on and so forth, right? Then you get to the point of classifying, because the previous step after you have categorized data, it helps you drive classification levels, for each of those data elements, and then you tag the data with policies that you decide that this is how I'm going to be, creating and implementing controls on these data elements. And make sure you take advantage of automation. Manual processes are going to be very, very error prone, very, very ineffective when you're dealing with such a large amount of data across multiple data stores in your enterprise. One of the security veterans actually talked about this, that if it's not automated, it's broken. And I just love that phrase, right? So take advantage of the automation. And in industry, we've got so many tools and they're very, very good and mature solutions that are in place to help you automate in your data inventory phase of data protection. Data segmentation and categorization, I talked a little bit about, how you should be segmenting data, and then eventually getting to the categorization part. And these are just some examples, where it could be segmenting, could be data about individuals or things, or data about business. And then on the category side, you could be dealing with identity data, you could be dealing with payment data, sensitive data, demographic data, activity data, so on and so forth, right? Depending on which industry sector you're part of. Then you get to the classification, restricted, confidential, internal, public, and some enterprises may have a different data classification level. But at the end of the day, it needs to be consistent, within the enterprise, that how you're defining, what your individual data classification level actually means. So what that process looks like, right? The whole risk-based data protection framework end to end. So this is something that I'm going to be, building it up. So obviously we are talking about identifying the risk, which, starts with data inventory, where we are discovering data, classifying data, and eventually implementing tags. And this is also a repeat process, right? Because you don't want to do that once, because new data is being fed into the processes and into your enterprise, and schemas are changing. You are collecting additional data points that you did not collect before. So this has to be a repeat process to ensure that your data inventory is up to date. And then eventually you get to the risk assessment part, that you have identified the risk, you've created all the inventory, and now you want to get to the point of risk assessment quantification, so that you can now prioritize which risks you're going to be going after. So work with your colleagues, on the risk management side, the GRC, the governance, risk, and compliance side. There are very, very mature tools and frameworks, whether you're talking about NIST or ISO or FAIR, different methodologies you can actually adopt. So work with your peers there to help you assess the risk, quantify them, and eventually that helps you prioritize. And depending on what you have found in that assessment process, not all data or not all data stores or profiles actually have same risks. So you want to create different profiles for data protection based on those risks. And once you have that, you update your policies, make the awareness program robust, that everybody understands what it is that they're required to do, and then start enforcing those through enterprise policies and standards. So then you get to the risk mitigation, right? Depending on which profile you fit, you either are going to be avoiding the risk or accepting a transfer. But as we talked about, that the focus is around reduction of risk, because in a lot of cases the other three may not be a viable option at all. And in the reduction phase, here you're looking at various strategies, right? You can minimize data. That obviously will be assessed under retention policy. In case you don't need to keep that data, there's a lot of risk that you are just unnecessarily holding on to and adding to your inherent risk profile. So minimization is one of the ways that you could reduce the risk if you are not required to keep that data. In other cases, we are legally obligated to keep data for a certain number of years, and once that is done, then obviously there's no point in keeping that data. Data protection often starts, when you're talking about reduction of risk, data protection starts with access control, right? So who has access to the data? How are they accessing? At what point they're accessing? How are we auditing them? Is something that we give them a blanket access to a database, given that their role is, a DBA or whatever, or even if they have access to the data, which fields that they get access to. So in a lot of cases, we might implement data at rest encryption and then implement dynamic data masking in places, right? Because 10 people could have access to the database, but 5 people may have access to the PII field, and the other 5 will actually not have access to, which means that they will see the data masked. And then masking could mean redaction or tokenization, format preserving encryption, date shifting, and so on and so forth. So there's various ways to mask data. You could de-identify data, where even before you store the data, you tokenize it or encrypt it or hash it, and then you store it there. So the data persistently stays de-identified. So it's not about data encryption at rest, that as soon as the data comes out, transparently it becomes unencrypted and you can see the data in the clear. We're actually having the data stay persistently protected, that even after it's accessed, unless you have the keys or the access rights to re-identify the data, you will still see the data in the de-identified form. And then there could be, other privacy enhancing technologies, where it's homomorphic encryption, um, could be a secure multi-party, computation, differential privacy, data encryption in use, like in memory, right? So things like confidential computing, secure enclaves, those are some of the things that will also be reducing the risk. And all of these take people, process, technology. Right? It's not just you buy a solution and boom, you have a risk reduction. No, it has to follow a process. There should be things that have to be done in the right order and then managed. And then of course you need people. And then at the end of the day, you need to make sure that you're auditing and you're reporting on the progress of your risk reduction. And once those are done, then basically you're feeding that back into the policy updates and the awareness and enforcement. Because in the auditing and the reporting, if we find that even though the policies were pushed, even though the tools and solutions were available, but certain teams have actually not done anything. So it's very important to make sure that things are addressed as they have been identified. And then it also goes back to your data inventory process, because then you're probably looking at some things in the audit and then reports that came out that you need to probably go back and then make sure your inventory is updated. So all of these things, kind of play together in the risk-based, data protection framework. So to conclude, I leave you with some recommendations. Obviously, as I said before, these are some of the things that are practical implementation experience that I'm sharing, and they are not absolute requirements. And these are some of the things that I've seen in action, and this is something that you could consider adopting. So the first thing is, earlier you inventory the data, the more you help reduce risk. You want to do this at the point of ingestion, right? When data is being collected, not an after the fact, right? As data is being collected, you want to make sure that you inventory right there. You understand what data is coming, you tag it with the policy, you map, with the privacy and security control for that data before data gets to be stored and used and processed, before data is externally shared, and before data is required to be deleted as per the data retention policy. Now, I talked a little bit about the data protection profiles, which is obviously risk-based. So one of the things I want to make sure that you understand is that different data protection approaches, which let's say we call it profiles, is also something that you want to make sure that it's appropriate for the risk level. You want to overdo something for a risk level that was very small to begin with, and in those cases you may have a very little security control in place, like turn on data encryption at rest, but ensure, of course, you control the keys. And in those cases, you might want to use, like if you're in cloud, like the KMS service or your enterprise KMS, and make sure you have that customer managed encryption key, model or option or equivalent of that. Ensure that your storage buckets or data warehouses, from a network perspective, they're well segmented. They are not open to the public internet. And then you also make sure that you implement proper IAM roles. So that could be sufficient, for something that is low risk. This particular control may be absolutely fine, for something that is of low risk. But as you start increasing, the risk level, then you might have to do something more. In this case, on top of, default encryption at rest and proper network segmentation and configuration and key management, ensure that your identities and credentials are well managed. And access is just not about simple role-based, right? It has to be a little bit more granular. In this case, ensure your credentials are managed within secret vaults and your dynamic authorization policies are put in place, where you are also looking at attribute or context. Like if Sid Dutta, has been defined a role of admin, but if Sid Dutta's credentials are being used from, let's say, Russia or China when Sid Dutta is in Cincinnati, that's something that is abnormal, right? So your dynamic authorization needs to kick in that case, that even though the credentials used were of Sid Dutta, but it doesn't look like, this is the normal place where he logs in from, right? So the IP address could be entirely different. So those are some of the things that could be implemented on top of that. Now, as you go again higher up in the risk meter, I guess, you could even implement dynamic data masking, where even though you have access to the database and you can log in, and all of your attributes and contexts, they pass, but you're not required to see, let's say, a social security number column, or you're not required to see a salary, right, of an employee. So in those cases, for your profile, those columns can be dynamically masked. That means as you're viewing it, they'll be masked to something else, right? So obfuscated or replaced or, wiped off or XXXXXX. And as you go higher into the risk profile, start looking at de-identifying your critical assets, the crown jewels. You don't want to leave them under the protection of transparent database encryption or even dynamic data masking. You want to make sure that data is persistently pseudonymized. And then for users who actually need to see the data in the clear, you can unmask it dynamically. So instead of dynamic data masking, we're talking about dynamic data unmasking, because data is masked all the time, as opposed to it's in the clear all the time and you mask it when it's required, but it's the other way around. That gives you higher security posture, because if data gets exfiltrated, the hacker essentially gets de-identified data. And then you get higher and higher up for the critical, particularly in cases of cloud, implement a hold your own key, that you don't even let the cloud services providers have any access to the keys in a KMS, like CMKs and stuff. And then introduce and experiment privacy enhancing technologies at select use cases, as and when you see that I need more protection on top of everything else. So thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to me patiently, and I hope this session was informative, and this is something that will help you in the future. And feel free to reach out to me. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm very active there. You can find me, connect with me, and we can have a chat. And hope this conference turns out to be an amazing experience for you. There's a lot of great content, a great array of speakers lined up. So with that, I want to thank you again for your time, and enjoy the conference.
Thank you so much, Sid. Appreciate your presentation. I know Sid is traveling, so please welcome back Puneet Singh to help us with a few questions that have come up during that presentation. Thanks, Puneet.
Thank you, Kyla.
So the first question, when should we just apply data encryption at rest versus performing data de-identification or masking?
So how I see this question is that it's like a pretty broad question. And secondly, whenever you think of the data protection methods, which is encryption, tokenization, and masking, as Sid was talking about, there are two ways you have to look at this problem. One is the risk-based approach, or you can have a regulation-based approach kind of thing. And what is the best way to handle this would be to go with the risk-based approach, because if we go with the risk-based approach, you will definitely able to meet the regulations as well as reduce the overall risk throughout your organization. Now, when we are going with the risk-based approach, again, there is you have to look at the data life cycle. That data either is going to be at rest, or it's going to be in motion, or it's going to be in use. So as Sid talked about, that you need to apply the data protection controls, which has to be persistent, so that the data is in the protected format throughout its life cycle, whether it's rest, in use, or motion. So in short, basically, if you want to meet the regulation and you don't have much of the time and you want to go with a tactical approach, then basically transparent encryption is the one basically which most of the organization uses. But if you think from the risk perspective, and if you're looking from the threat modeling perspective, and if you want to mitigate most of the risk present in your organization, then the best way to do would be to do the application level encryption. It's going to take time, but it's going to reduce the overall risk, and it's going to reduce the lot of threat vectors which are going to be out there. And again, uh, most of the regulations which are out there, they recognize the encryption, whether it's a GDPR, whether it's a HIPAA, whether it's a uh, other privacy regulations which are out there, they recognize the encryption. Now, masking and data de-identification have its own use cases, and there if has its own use cases, but most of the regulations don't recognize them. So again, if you are basically passing the data from your higher environments such as production to the lower environments, and you don't want to get that data muddy, or basically you want to have the clean data flowing throughout your organization, then basically it's the data de-identification of the masking would be a better use case. But if the regulation is your problem, then basically you have to basically do an encryption. Data de-identification, the masking is not going to solve all the problems.
Okay, thank you, Puneet. I have another question here relating to that. When it
Mhm.
comes to risk mitigation phase in the framework presented,
Mhm.
when and how can it be determined if the risk can be accepted even after some security controls are put in place?
Okay. So how I see this is that there are different phases are there for the risk mitigation. Risk can either be avoided, accepted, transferred, or reduced. Now, risk acceptance, prior or after implementing a security technology or anything like that, the best way would be to do a assessment. Once you have done a proper assessment, then basically you can quantify the risk, and then you need to talk to the in the organization with the different teams, such as the GRC team or the legal team, and based on that quantification of the risk, you can either accept it or you can have the compensating control to do that.
Okay, thank you, Puneet. And I have one more question here. When it comes to choosing between risk-based approach and a compliance-driven approach,
Mhm.
why is the risk-based approach recommended? I know
So
we touched.
it's all basically like a ties back to the first question back again, that why the risk based approach? Because normally if you're going with a regulation based approach, uh, how I see is that, let's take an example of the NYDFS, which is one of the regulations based in New York, for all the residents of New York. It talks about that you need to encrypt the data, and it basically doesn't talks about that at what layer you should apply the encryption. So if you just do the transparent encryption, the problem what happens is that it's easy to do, but as the means like when the data is residing at rest, that layer of the encryption is attached to that. But when the user or anybody is basically using that data, that layer basically unwraps. And if means like now hackers have become smart enough, so what happens is that if it's a transparent encryption, the data would be in the clear while being used. So if they have done the session hijacking or anything like that, then it would be much more easy for them to compromise the data. That's pretty much it, Kala.
Okay, thank you, Puneet. I really appreciate you taking the time to join us for the questions that came up during this session. We're going to take a 5-minute break, and then we're going to come back with our next session. So stand by, and we'll see you in about 5 minutes. Thanks, Puneet.
Thank you, Kala.